Hello, Professor Thomas. What are you going to talk about today?
I would like to talk about species distribution modeling. So species distribution modeling is when you have observations of species, animals, plants, can be anything, and you know locations where they are, and ideally you also know locations where they are not.
Okay.
Right? And then you can link those observations with environmental conditions, temperature, rainfall, vegetation cover.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why do we do that?
Well, if we have both data sets and the observations and the environmental conditions, what we can do is we can make models, statistical models that describe relationships. So we can find out, okay, under which conditions is it very likely to find the species, and under which conditions is it less likely to find these species.
Okay. Is this something that we do for conservation of species? What?
Well, multiple reasons. One is indeed conservation. So if you have a species that is of high conservation value, panda bears, polar bear, whatever, these kind of things, then we can basically make maps of which areas are suitable for this species, and then we can make decisions on not invade those areas or make protect them. But it's also very relevant if you look at pest species. For example, fruit flies that can infest certain areas, and well, some areas are more prone to those flies than other areas. So then for agriculture, it sometimes has the opposite reason, not to protect, but to actually exterminate.
Okay.
And also for diseases, some diseases are carried by vectors, mosquitoes or flies or whatever, and then also this technique can work to find out which areas are more likely to get these diseases.
Okay. So how do we build a map?
So we have observations, those are points. So we know here is a fly, here's not a fly or whatever. But there's in between many other locations for which perhaps we do know the environmental conditions. So we know the temperature there, we know the vegetation cover. And then with these models, we can also make predictions how likely is it to find those species there. So one of the key applications is to make these models and then interpolate over an entire area to say, okay, which areas are suitable and which areas are not suitable.
I see. One of the things that you mentioned are diseases carried by, let's say, mosquitoes. How does that link to geohealth?
Well, actually people in geohealth use species distribution modeling also to map out the vectors for diseases. Actually we have projects, for example, on tsetse flies. And tsetse flies carry trypanosomiasis, which is sleeping sickness. And they have very particular requirements, for example, on vegetation. They want to have a lot of shade because otherwise it gets too hot for them. But of course they also need to be close to humans or animals to transfer the disease. They're often in a symbiosis. So you can model all and the animals and the humans and the flies, and then you can make areas of which are likely to have these diseases.
Okay. Who uses those maps?
Well, so a lot of people use these maps. You mentioned already conservation. So for conservation, it's very useful to make maps of target species, species you want to conserve. Agronomists use them. For example, we did a project where we looked at rice and we mapped out which areas are suitable for rice and which areas are not suitable for rice. So that's an application. And disease. So how do you plan interventions to eradicate, for example, disease-spreading species? But also planners use them. Another thing you can do with these models is if you have a good model, let's assume that because there's always a lot of critique, sometimes models are not so good, and then you should be very careful with them. If you have a good model and you find a relationship with climatic factors, and you know climate change, you can also make not predictions, but projections, we call them, of what would be suitable in the future for a certain crop, or where do we expect a disease to spread into because it's getting warmer. A typical example is West Nile virus in Europe. It's just going more and more north because it's getting warmer, and so those mosquitoes that transmit this are also able to survive longer and therefore carry these diseases. So it's also for future planning. This can be very useful. Okay,
I think one of the experiences we had here in Enschede, where we are, is that we also have a few plagues. One of them is the processionrups or the processionrups.
Processierups,
Is that something that has been mapped as well?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not a processierups expert, so I know this is indeed a bit of a health issue and also a plague insect, but there's a number of things that play a role there, which is perhaps indeed climate to some extent, but also we shouldn't forget where a species occurs is not only a result of climate, but also of the predators. And the processierups, that little caterpillar, is being eaten by birds, and if it's not going good with the bird population, they cannot control that. So often there's also again, something you could model, how is the control population of animals that predate on the species going? Yeah, but then it becomes really tricky, because then you have a species that relies on environmental conditions, but also biotic conditions, and that is a little bit more difficult to model. Then we would call it more biological, dynamical models.
Okay. Yeah. Well, definitely the climate change issue is very. I have a lot of curiosity for that. Do we have like a world view of how is that affecting all? Do we have let's say a holistic view of how everything is moving towards? We start to get that, right? So we're trying to make those models, and of course it depends on at what scale you look at it. At a global level, and you can start modeling at really coarse global level, and the general trend is that suitable areas for species are declining and moving north, or in the mountains they move up. But there are of course exceptions to that. So when you zoom in to a smaller scale, only the Netherlands or only the province of Overijssel, then you see much more intricate differences there. So there are species that are actually benefiting. Their suitable ranges are expanding, and also species of conservation interest. So in the Netherlands, a very good example is butterflies. Butterflies that used not to be able to survive in the Netherlands in the winter are now able to survive. So the butterfly enthusiasts are sometimes very happy because they see very rare species for the Netherlands that used to only survive in Mediterranean climates. But the general trend seems to be that climate is driving species more north, but also sometimes it's going so fast, for example, for plant species, that they cannot keep up with the pace, so they're basically lagging behind. And then even though perhaps there's a range expansion, more areas becoming suitable for them, they're not able to use that because there's a barrier or something like that. Okay. And we should also not forget it's not only climate change that is threatening where species can occur, it's also land use change. So humans are really fragmenting landscapes by building cities and roads and all these kind of things. So the combination of climate change and land use change is often kind of the real killer. The two together, they're kind of enforcing each other. Okay. Yeah. And just a little change of subject, but how do we get data? Is this something on the ground, or do you use Earth observation for that?
That's a very good question. So basically we have two sets of data. One is the observations of a species. And there's many ways you can get data. The traditional way is the scientist going out in the field with binoculars making recordings. And that's how it has been done in the past. But that costs a lot of money and time. So and often we don't have money or time. An alternative is voluntary information. There's a lot of enthusiasts out there that are interested in birds or butterflies or amphibians. So they record this. There's many apps on your telephone. You can sign up to observation.org or waarneming.nl, and you can add your observations, and then actually those are being uploaded to a depository. So scientists can access that data and use that.
Oh, very nice.
So that's really nice. Of course, there is a bit of a risk there that this data is collected often by non-experts, so we have a risk of misclassification. And people go and look for nice animals and birds in specific places, right? So nobody's going to look for animals at other places. And that also points to one of the biggest issues in species distribution modeling, having observations of where species do not occur. So everybody thinks, I think there's a rare species there. You go there, you see it, and you say, hey, I saw the species. But nobody goes to another place to basically say, look, it's not here. And to give an example, we have a project now on wild boars, and we do that with, and that's actually a third way of getting data, wild cameras. And so those are cameras you can install somewhere, and they basically take a picture if something moves in front of them, and then you can determine afterwards what it is. We had to put them in an area somewhere here in Overijssel,
And it was for wild boars. So people said, we know where they are, so we know where to put them. And then we said, well, we also want to put them in places where we do not expect them. And those are very expensive cameras. So the people said, yeah, that's a waste of money.
Yeah.
So we really had to convince them. We also need, the blank spots to confirm that they're really blank spots.
I see.
Yeah. So those are the three main things. And then there's a fourth one, which is tracking. So what you could also do, of course, is capture an animal, put a GPS tag on them, release them again, and then see, okay, where are they going? So those are the four major ways to collect data for observations.
Do you want to be a GeoHero as well? Then take the first step and click the subscribe button and then the bell button to always be the first to know when one of our GeoHeroes posts a new video.